everyone, I'm Chanel Call in for Vladimir Duthiers, and we are watching all the news happening here in the U.S. and around the world. This hour, President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin are expected to speak as President Trump hopes to secure a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. Plus, we're hearing from former President Biden for the first time since his cancer diagnosis, what we're learning about his condition and prognosis. And residents across the Midwest surveyed damage from deadly, powerful tornadoes. We'll go there live for the latest recovery efforts and tell you where this dangerous storm is moving next. This is CBS News 24/7. And our top story this morning, at any moment, President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin will be getting on a phone call to talk about ending the war in Ukraine. President Trump also plans to speak to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and NATO leaders today. Now, all of this is happening as Russia intensifies drone strikes in Ukraine. Ukraine says Russia launched its largest drone attack since the war began, with hundreds of strikes overnight. The White House says President Trump's goal here is to reach a peace agreement as soon as possible.
Well, I think, again, we'll see how the call goes, and the president has made it clear his goal is to see a ceasefire and to see this conflict come to an end. And he's grown weary and frustrated with both sides of the conflict. The president and his team have put an enormous amount of effort in solving this very complicated war that, again, began because of the last administration's weakness.
And we have team coverage for you this hour with our Natalie Brand at the White House and senior foreign correspondent Elizabeth Palmer live for us from London. Natalie, I want to start with you and talk about what President Trump is expected to say during this call. And also, what do you think his approach is going to be this time?
Chanel, good to be with you. We got a little bit of insight here from Vice President J.D. Vance, who spoke to reporters while traveling back from Rome. And he said he thinks President Trump is really going to ask President Putin if he's serious about these negotiations, if he has a strategy for how to unwind the war. And Vance also saying that the U.S. position, the Trump administration's position, has been to say to Russia that there are economic benefits to thawing relations between Russia and the rest of the world, but that those benefits will not be seen if Russia continues to kill innocent people. Again, that's according to the vice president speaking to reporters this morning. He also said that the U.S. wants to see outcomes here, that there's been this impasse. We saw, direct talks happen between Ukraine and Russia late last week, but the key players weren't there. So again, the question becomes in this call, can President Trump move the ball forward? The White House press secretary Caroline Leavitt saying that we will have readouts from these series of calls. Keep in mind, it's not only the Russian president that President Trump will be speaking to, but then later President Zelenskyy and also NATO members. Chanel.
And Natalie, we know that timing here is so key. I want to play for you and our viewers part of what Secretary of State Marco Rubio said yesterday on Face the Nation.
We don't want to be involved in this process of just endless talks. There has to be some progress, some movement forward. Ultimately, one of the things that could help break this logjam, perhaps the only thing that can, is a direct conversation between President Trump and Vladimir Putin.
So, Natalie, I'm just thinking out loud here. I mean, if these phone calls today don't work out, what, if anything, can the Trump administration do to try to secure a deal in the future?
Well, we heard from President Trump last week that he thinks that progress can be made by speaking directly to Putin, meeting him in person. Obviously, we're starting with this phone call. Caroline Leavitt, during the press briefing, which wrapped short time ago, was asked, would the president be up to meeting Russian President Putin in person, and she indicated that he would be, but also made clear, let's see how this phone call goes first. Another thing that we know the administration is watching, following those talks in Turkey, both sides are supposed to come up with a document, a proposal, some details about what they envision for a ceasefire. Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying he will be watching to see whether those documents are rational and realistic. Chanel.
All right, Natalie Brand live for us at the White House. Thank you, Natalie. And now I want to bring in Elizabeth Palmer live for us from London this hour. Liz, European leaders met last week without, notably, Putin and Zelenskyy meeting face to face. And there was a little bit of progress here. Could this call between Presidents Trump and Putin really result in some progress here?
Look, it's possible, but it's certainly far from a sure thing. And it rests on President Putin's intentions. Basically, it's not clear that he is serious about ending the war. You heard the frustration in the words of Vice President Vance. The White House must have serious doubts at this stage. Respected military analysts think that the problem for Putin is that he faces a dangerous political moment for himself and his government once the war comes to an end. Thousands of troops will come back home to Russia. Many of them will have PTSD. They won't be on the big military salaries anymore. And Russians all over the country at that stage will begin asking whether the whole thing was worth it. Well over 250,000 dead and wounded. And of course, their country having become an international pariah. When I was there last week, all I heard from Russians, speaking off the record, is they just want peace. They're not happy with the way things have gone so far.
So, Liz, Middle East Special Envoy Steve Witkoff says, there's an art to these kinds of negotiations. Let's listen.
The art here is to narrow that wide berth between the parties. And I think to some extent we've done that. To some extent, each party is staking out their positions. And I think Monday will go a long way towards identifying where we are and how we complete this negotiation.
So, Elizabeth, just to get some perspective on this, what are the sticking points for each side that have so far prevented a deal from going through?
Well, I think there's just one, basically. Russia's price for peace is too high. We had it spelled out again in the talks in Istanbul, where relatively low-level Russian delegations showed up. But their message was, we want to keep 4 provinces of Ukraine in any settlement, including land that its military hasn't yet taken. In other words, it wants Ukraine to hand over territory that Ukrainian soldiers have been dying to defend. And this is something, obviously, President Zelenskyy won't and can't accept. Even going into this call with President Trump in a little while, the Kremlin is still signaling that it's not budging on that demand. In fact, the spokesman said it would be nice if Russia could get its way by diplomatic means. But the implication there is, even if it doesn't, it's not going to change its demands. It's just going to fight on.
All right, Elizabeth Palmer, live for us in London this hour. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Former President Joe Biden is speaking out for the first time since news of his prostate cancer diagnosis was made public. He posted on X this morning saying, quote, "Cancer touches us all. Like so many of you, Jill and I have learned that we are strongest in the broken places. Thank you for lifting us up with love and support." All right, for more on this story, I want to go live to CBS News White House reporter Willie James Inman. Willie James, good to see you this morning. So what else do we know about the former president's diagnosis at this point?
Hey there, Chanel. Good to see you as well. Well, we know from a statement coming from the former president's office is that he was diagnosed with prostate cancer, an aggressive form of that disease, last Friday. We know that he went to the doctor. He essentially received some tests. He had some urinary symptoms. We know that not only is this an aggressive form of this disease, it's also a form that will respond well to treatment, according to a statement from the former president's office, and his family is looking at those treatment options. But earlier, we spoke to a doctor about how this could have an effect on the former president. Take a listen.
I think his prognosis is really going to be dependent upon the genetics of the tumor. At 82, he's not in poor health. But obviously, the therapies would have more effect on him potentially. Many of the medical therapies are quite effective these days and give patients longevity, even at 82 with high-risk prostate cancer.
President Biden is the oldest president to serve as commander-in-chief, and as his family looks for those options, we've seen an outpouring of support from political leaders across the ideological spectrum.
Yeah, can you walk us through some of the reaction that you've been seeing, Willie James?
Yeah, that's right. We've been seeing this come out through the weekend. His former running mate, for instance, Vice President Kamala Harris, who, of course, ran against Donald Trump after the former president dropped out of the race. She sent a statement on behalf of herself and Doug Emhoff, her husband. She goes on to say, Doug and I are saddened to learn of President Biden's prostate cancer diagnosis. And then she continues to say that she's keeping him and Dr. Biden and their entire family in their hearts and prayers. So one of the other statements I want to point out is coming from the former rival of President Biden. That is coming from President Trump himself and the First Lady, where both the President and the First Lady say that they were saddened to hear about the diagnosis that President Biden received, but also wishing him a fast and successful recovery. So politics aside, a lot of politicians putting those politics and former rivals aside and wishing the former president a speedy recovery as we wait to see about his prognosis and how he's feeling in light of this cancer diagnosis.
Yep, we'll keep a close eye on this. Willie James, thank you. Well, the House Budget Committee has now advanced President Trump's so-called big, beautiful budget bill after initial concerns from some conservative Republicans over spending cuts. The bill moves one step closer to a floor vote before a Memorial Day deadline, but its path in the Senate still remains unclear. I want to bring in CBS News congressional correspondent Caitlin Huey-Burns, who's on Capitol Hill for us this hour. Caitlin, what changed for Republicans here? I mean, why move forward with this now?
Yeah, Chanel, great to see you. Remember, last Friday, this bill didn't make it out of committee. You had 4 conservative lawmakers vote with Democrats to block it from advancing. They then reconvened last night, and it passed. But because it passed because those 4 conservative lawmakers voted present. And that signaled that, okay, they want the bill to move forward, but they do have some deep, deep reservations with it. Namely, they don't believe the spending cuts in this bill go far enough. But over the weekend, as they were meeting with Speaker Johnson and other Republican leaders, they did secure some concessions. One of them revolves around the sticking point involving Medicaid. In this bill, there's a new work requirement, but that wasn't set to phase in until 2029, after President Trump will have left office. Those hardliners wanted that to be phased in earlier, and they've gotten some commitments that that will be the case. But they still have a lot to work through in terms of deeper cuts that they want to see. So now that this has passed the Budget Committee, it then has to go through the Rules Committee. I know everybody's eyes are glazing over at all this process, but that is where they can add even more changes to this bill before it gets to the floor on Thursday. Bottom line, there is still a lot of work to do before Thursday, and even if it's put to the floor, there's no sure bet it will pass. They can only afford to lose really a couple of votes here.
And so I want to ask Caitlin about how the president may be playing a part in all this, because last week he said he doesn't want to see any grandstanders holding up this bill. Do you have a sense of how involved he may be in the next steps?
Yeah, we know that his team is very involved, and he is going to start applying the pressure because this contains his legislative agenda. He's been able to do so much, Chanel, as you know, through executive order. But in order to get these key items, these key campaign promises that he made, no taxes on tips or overtime pay, for example, making the Trump tax cuts that were passed during his first term permanent, and also funding for a lot of his priorities in terms of the military and immigration enforcement, that all has to be done through Congress. And so he needs this piece of legislation to enact his agenda. So he's going to be applying that political pressure. And he served before as kind of the chief, whip in this regard. But the question I have is what that political pressure can actually do. You have moderate Republicans who aren't as inclined to that, and also conservatives who haven't really, bowed to the president.
So given that dynamic, I mean, can this pass the Senate if it gets there?
Yeah, and that's the big question, Chanel, if it even gets there. And if it does, you've already seen Senate Republicans voice their concern with this bill, saying it needs to go through a lot of changes before they can support it. So even if it passed the Senate, it would still have to go back to the House with those changes. A long way to go. But I will leave you with this, that one Republican Senator, Ron Johnson from Wisconsin, has already called this
has already equated this to the Titanic. In other words,
wow,
a sinking ship.
All right, Caitlin, thanks for the update. We appreciate this. And still ahead this hour, some new details about that boat that crashed into the Brooklyn Bridge this past weekend, killing 2 crew members. The very latest on the investigation just ahead. Stay with us. You're streaming CBS News 24/7. Hey, welcome back. Residents in Kentucky are cleaning up this morning after devastating tornadoes swept through parts of the state. At least 19 people were killed and hundreds of homes were severely damaged. CBS News correspondent Nicole Valdez joins me now from London, Kentucky with more on this. Nicole, great to see you there. Walk us through what it looks like there this morning because we see so much damage behind you there.
Chanel, I think it's horrifying, to put it bluntly, because you're looking at what's left of people's homes, and there really isn't much. I mean, you can see inside their kitchen, their bathroom, every wall that surrounded their home, now sitting on their lawn, on the floor in pieces. That shows you the strength of a storm like this. We're talking about what officials believe was an EF3 tornado, powerful enough to level entire neighborhoods and shred even brick homes like this one, and the devastation goes on for miles. Laurel County is unfortunately where we've seen so much of the destruction and where we know a majority of the now 19 people confirmed dead in the state of Kentucky alone lost their lives. Governor Beshear was here over the weekend meeting with those victims who not only have lost those loved ones, but who have truly lost everything, really trying to give them the support they need to try to get back on their feet. And thankfully, there is a lot of people here hoping to do that, whether that's people's own neighbors bringing food, water, supplies, offering shelter, or state resources like Kentucky State Police, the National Guard, of course, local police here. They're doing everything they can to try to lend a helping hand to what is going to be a painfully long recovery process.
Yeah, and Nicole, every time I see a home like that behind you that's just been decimated by weather, I think about the people that live there, the families. And I know you've been speaking to so many folks on the ground. What are you hearing?
You know, the stories of where people ran to and just how quickly they had to react when they realized that they were in the path of this tornado is really just jaw-dropping. I mean, we've spoken to families who have, had mere minutes to run from wherever they were in their house into the most interior part of their home. In some cases, that was a bathroom. For one family, that was 5 people that crammed into a tiny hallway, praying and really shielding each other with their bodies. And what happened at the end was their roof was torn off. Every wall was down except for the ones that surrounded them. So their stories of survival are just so painful to hear. But you can also tell just how grateful they are to be alive, knowing that so many others didn't make it through.
And Nicole, we also see in your shot there are some folks who are there on the scene. It appears to be crews who are there cleaning up some of that wreckage. Talk to us about the process moving forward.
Yeah, well, we know this, of course, takes some time when you've got damage to this extent to clean up, right? What we've seen really for the last few days is a lot of neighbors, a lot of friends, a lot of family members that have come from wherever they live to just start that process and pick up the pieces, right? But they're going to need a lot more help throughout the days, weeks, and months to come. So that is hopefully going to happen in the way of not only state resources, but federal resources. We understand that the Laurel County Fire Department here expects FEMA on the ground today to start doing their assessments here of the damage and then start getting applications in so that people can start trying to rebuild their homes or their lives. Again, that doesn't happen overnight, and so we'll see once we start to see all that start to take place.
Such harrowing stories. Nicole Valdez, thank you for this really important reporting. Appreciate it. All right, let's now bring in CBS News Philadelphia meteorologist Andrew Kozak with our first look at our national weather forecast. Talk about the system that just passed through where Nicole was.
Yeah, Chanel, good morning. We are looking at this system that is continuing to be dynamic, not only for those areas that were affected yesterday, but as you can see, we still have a pretty big picture for the storms that are not only across this area again for today, but extending all the way up to the northern plains. It's going to be another rough afternoon. And while areas that did get hit yesterday will likely see a chance for some storms again today, this afternoon, the bullseye is a little further west. This is going to be for Oklahoma up I-44 from areas like Oklahoma City to Tulsa and up to Springfield. There is a very good chance today that we'll not only be looking at a pretty large tornado risk this afternoon, but also damaging wind in excess of 65 to 70 miles per hour and some large hail. This is where we're going to be focusing our attention today. We'll come back in a little bit and take a look at more specific forecasts as we head into the rest of your very busy week ahead. Janelle?
All right, Andrew Kozak, thank you. Vice President J.D. Vance met Pope Leo earlier today. The Vatican said the two exchanged views on current international issues. Their meeting followed the pontiff's inaugural mass yesterday. An estimated 200,000 people were there, including the vice president and many other world leaders. CBS News foreign correspondent Chris Livesay joins us now from Rome this morning. Good to see you, Chris. So tell us more about this morning's meeting between Vance and Pope Leo.
Well, by all accounts, it was a cordial encounter. It lasted about 45 minutes. They exchanged views on international topics. They also exchanged gifts. We know that J.D. Vance presented the pontiff with a Bears jersey that said Pope Leo XIV on the back of it. So it seems like a very happy reset, which is exactly what both camps were hoping for when you consider the kind of contentious relationship that existed between Pope Francis and the Trump administration. You might remember even when Trump was just a candidate heading up into his first term, Pope Francis, commenting on the border with Mexico, said that to build walls was unchristian. And we know that Pope Leo has shared his at least big heart for migrants and the downtrodden, but we also know that Pope Leo has a brother who is an outspoken MAGA Republican. So at the very least, Pope Leo is sensitive to these dynamics and divisions that exist in the United States. And the Trump administration was clearly eager to capitalize on this historic moment of electing the very first American Pope.
All right, Chris Livesay, thank you. And coming up this hour, what we're now learning about the suspect accused of bombing a fertility clinic in Palm Springs, California, and why investigators there are calling this an act of terrorism. Stay with us. You're streaming CBS News 24/7. Here's a look at some of the top stories we're following right now. There's a manhunt underway in New Orleans for 7 inmates that escaped from jail and are considered armed and dangerous. 10 prisoners broke free on Friday in what Louisiana Governor Jeff Landry called the largest and possibly worst jailbreak in the state's history. They reportedly climbed through a hole they cut in the wall, and they weren't discovered missing for hours. Officials believe they may have had inside help. 3 have since been captured, and the FBI is now offering $10,000 for information leading to the recapture of each inmate. CBS News' Katie Weiss will be live in New Orleans following this story throughout the day. New Jersey's first transit strike in decades is officially over, but service is still not restored. New Jersey Transit and its rail engineers have now reached a tentative agreement over the weekend to end that 3-day strike. About 100,000 daily riders, including those traveling in and out of New York City, were impacted. Regular train service is expected to resume tomorrow. The tentative deal still has to be approved by the National Union and the state's first transit board. And Britain and the European Union have agreed to a landmark trade deal this morning. This marks the first major reset of relations since Brexit. The agreement is expected to remove some trade barriers and boost security on the continent. The deal will reportedly allow the two sides to work more closely together as the Trump administration has signaled pulling back on its commitment to European security. Israel says it will allow basic humanitarian aid into Gaza after a nearly 3-month-long blockade. Aid groups have been warning about the depleting food supplies in the enclave. And this morning, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu admitted pressure from allies was behind the move. Now, this comes as Israeli forces have now launched a new ground offensive in Gaza. And for more on this, I want to bring in CBS News foreign correspondent Deborah Pata, who is following the latest from Tel Aviv this hour. So, Deborah, what's behind the latest move in Gaza this hour? What's happening there? And do we know when we'll begin to see aid flow in?
Well, as you pointed out, there has been a renewed offensive that's been ongoing for at least a week now in Gaza, a very punishing one, and well over 500 people have already been killed, according to the Gaza Health Ministry. It's been a 3-month blockade as well, nearly 3-month blockade, I should say, by Israel. But now it's saying it's going to allow a limited amount of humanitarian aid into Gaza, following a lot of global experts warning of a looming famine. Israel has said up until now that there were no food shortages, but last night, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that they will let in a limited amount of aid to avert what he called a starvation crisis, as to not do so would jeopardize this renewed military offensive. And we understand he is under pressure from his allies, including the US, to let that aid in. As of now, there has no aid has been let into Gaza, but a UN official has indicated they have 20 trucks that possibly could go in. But what's interesting to note is that after the last blockade, 600 trucks went in on one day alone. 20 trucks will be nowhere near enough. Chanel?
Yeah, that's an important point to make. As the fighting continues, Deborah, we know that you sat down with the parents of recently released Israeli-American hostage Idon Alexander. What did they tell you?
Well, Yael and Adi Alexander had flown to Israel, obviously, for their son's release, and they told us that they got the call about their son's release on Mother's Day at their home in Jersey from President Trump's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, to say Idon Alexander was going to be released. That was a week ago. They couldn't have really asked for a better Mother's Day gift. And Adi Alexander said he'd been using a leaf blower at the time and didn't realize he'd missed 8 calls from Witkoff. The deal was brokered by the U.S. directly with Hamas, and essentially they sidelined Israel. Let's take a listen to what they had to say.
The U.S. has been a crucial part of this negotiation.
So we're grateful for Steve, for President Trump, and for Adam Boehler. Great job, but the job is not done.
It's time for them to come home.
All of them, not in small pieces, just to bring everyone back home.
And they also told us that Idon is now out of hospital. He's still weak. He needs some medical attention. But more importantly, there obviously are a lot of emotional scars. He told his mother that he looks like a vampire. He's so pale, as he hasn't seen sunlight for nearly 19 months. Chanel?
The healing journey just beginning. Deborah Pata, thank you. The FBI has now identified 25-year-old Guy Edward Barkas as the suspect who detonated a car bomb outside a fertility clinic in Palm Springs, California on Saturday. Authorities say his body was found near the scene of the explosion. I want to bring in CBS News reporter Andres Gutierrez, who is in Palm Springs this hour. Andres, we see there is still a crime scene behind you this hour. What's the latest on the investigation there?
Well, Chanel, investigators say the explosives were found inside the vehicle of that 25-year-old, a 2010 Ford Fusion. The assistant director of the FBI Los Angeles field office says that this is the largest bombing in recent history here in Southern California. They did release his photograph because they're asking for the public's help. They know that he arrived here to Palm Springs at 6 a.m. Saturday, but now the explosion itself occurred at 11 a.m. They want to know, what did he do in that time in between? Did he scope out the clinic? Did he put the final touches on the bomb that he ended up detonating? So they're asking businesses and people who live in the area to scour their security cameras to see if they notice anything suspicious, whether it be the vehicle or Mr. Barkas, the suspect in this case. They also say that they believe that he tried to live stream this attack, and hours after the explosion, law enforcement ended up descending on his neighborhood over at 29 Palms, which is about an hour northeast of Palm Springs. They ended up clearing out the neighborhood as a precaution while they went in. They haven't released details about what they were able to find during the execution of that search warrant. But out here, the debris field was pretty large. The blast itself, according to witnesses I spoke with on Saturday, said they initially felt like it was an earthquake that shook them, but eventually they ended up shattering multiple windows at businesses around the clinic. The front offices of the clinic completely obliterated. Firefighters, though, were able to save the embryos that were in a lab in a separate building at the facility. And so at this point, they are going to continue operations today, serving those clients compliance at a temporary facility elsewhere.
And I know that police are still trying to gather more information and evidence in the investigation, but do we know more, Andres, about what may have motivated the suspect?
Well, agents say that the mentality of this 25-year-old was nihilistic, meaning that he didn't think that life mattered and that people should not bring kids into this world. They did find, again, signs that he was planning to live stream the attack, meaning that he wanted an audience, perhaps spread his message beyond this area. He also, FBI says that they don't have any evidence at this point that he belonged to an extremist group, and so they do believe that he acted alone. We did speak with his father, who says that they haven't talked in more than 10 years, but they did notice a difference once he moved out here to the desert, to that neighborhood out there in 29 Palms. And so it could be that the isolation, his beliefs, this ideology regarding about not parents bringing in kids into this world could have deepened his resentment to those who did want to have families.
Interesting. Okay, lots to follow here. Andres Gutierrez, thank you. The NTSB is expected to provide some new information in just a few hours on the fatal crash involving a ship that struck the Brooklyn Bridge on Saturday. Crew members were on the riggings during the collision, and some were left dangling after the impact. CBS News senior transportation correspondent Chris Van Cleve has more.
New York's mayor says it appears the ship lost power shortly after it pulled out of a pier near the Brooklyn Bridge. That would have left it at the mercy of the currents, which were pushing towards the Brooklyn Bridge. You can see the ship here, its masts snapped like a twig. Working up there in the riggings, we see a few people. On Saturday night, there were people up there as well. They were sent flying, left hanging more than 100 feet up as the ship hit the bridge and continued towards the shoreline. Now, the National Transportation Safety Board and its investigators have arrived in New York. One of their first priorities will be to see if there are any data recorders, any voice recorders on board that ship. If so, they'll want to get their hands on those to begin piecing together what may have gone wrong here. But it does appear some sort of mechanical issue essentially left the ship dead in the water as it was pulling out. The plan had been to go out to sea. It was going to stop at the Brooklyn waterfront to refuel, and then it was heading to Iceland as part of a goodwill tour that the ship was on. 277 people on board. We understand at least 19 have been hurt, 2 critically, and 2 young crew members have been killed. The Mexican Navy says it regrets this incident. About 177 or so people who are on board the ship have returned to Mexico. Around 100 crew members still here in New York as this NTSB investigation is now just beginning. Back to you.
Chris Van Cleve, thank you. And the judge in Sean Diddy Combs' sex trafficking trial is expected to decide this morning whether to throw out a portion of last week's testimony. It concerns a witness who was called after Combs' ex-girlfriend, Cassie Ventura, finished testifying on Friday. CBS News legal contributor Caroline Polisi joins us now here in Studio 57 in New York with more on this. Caroline, good to see you. So explain what testimony may be thrown out and why.
Yeah, Chanel, it's looking more and more like that testimony will not be thrown out. Obviously, last week was all about the star witness, Cassie Ventura, star victim, I should say. She's victim number 1 in that government indictment. But the testimony from Dawn Richard was meant to corroborate some of Cassie's abuse. And part of that corroboration was an incident that she testified about when Diddy actually, she alleged, hit Cassie with a skillet. She was making eggs. He got, enraged and hit her with a skillet. Now, she also testified that thereafter, Diddy told her that people who spoke about these types of things tend to disappear, and that she took that as a threat on her life. The defense attorneys, rightfully so, objected to a lot of this testimony, saying much of it was hearsay. In trials, there are very strict rules of evidence. The judge is concerned that a lot of these now corroborating witnesses may be veering into hearsay, gossip. You only want witnesses to testify, and they're only allowed to testify to things that they directly saw or heard. So that's part of this objection, as well as this statement that Diddy be apparently made to her. We're already seeing the defense today really try to get into those inconsistencies in Richard's testimony about whether did she actually witness this abuse or did she just see perhaps the aftermath of it. So that's kind of the issue here. The issue is the scope of the testimony. It does seem that the judge is going to allow that testimony to stand on Friday, but going into more of this testimony today, there may be a sort of a tighter scope around what they can testify to.
Yeah, and I wonder, because you mentioned this, Cassie finishing her days-long stretch of emotional testimony last week, and how will her testimony then impact how the case moves forward?
Yeah, she was a very credible witness, I do have to say. Obviously testified to years of abuse. The defense is already acknowledging that this was a domestic violence relationship. The question is, can the prosecution prove that this was sex trafficking, that this was a RICO conspiracy? So you'll see witnesses this week like Cassie's mother, her best friend of over 17 years, corroborating this information about the abuse. Now, the defense is saying, all right, there were instances of abuse, but how is that relevant necessarily to forced fraud or coercion relating to sex trafficking? So that's kind of what the argument is here. The defense is saying these are just bad acts witnesses. We call them bad acts witnesses because traditionally that type of testimony is not allowed in trials when that specific conduct isn't being charged. He's not being charged with domestic violence or assault in this case. So that will be an issue coming up. But I think it's all about corroboration this week.
Yeah, that's an interesting point to make. And Caroline, also want to ask just about next steps. Are there any other key witnesses that you'll be expecting to hear from?
Yeah, certainly. Remember, there are other victims in this case. There are other co-conspirators in this case that haven't been charged. So we're expected to hear from personal assistants and chefs, things like that, to Diddy, and whether or not they are sort of victims as well as co-conspirators. That'll be maybe a fine line to draw, but certainly with information about drug use. Remember, we heard about that potential arson, obstruction of justice. Remember, those are more of the elements involved in this racketeering conspiracy that the government really hasn't gotten on the table yet, and I would expect we would hear this week.
All right, Caroline Polisi, thank you.
Thank you.
We're keeping a close eye this hour on Wall Street as the market fall after Moody's downgraded the U.S.'s credit rating. What this all means for you and your money next. Stay with us. You're streaming CBS News 24/7. Well, investors on Wall Street are digesting the news of credit agency Moody's now downgrading the U.S. credit rating. The agency says the change is due to concerns of rising government debt. On Meet the Press yesterday, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent disagreed with the downgrade.
I think that Moody's is a lagging indicator. I think that's what everyone thinks of credit agencies. Larry Summers and I don't agree on everything, but he said that when they downgraded the U.S. in 2011. So it's a lagging indicator.
And for more on this story, I want to bring in Javier David. He is the business editor for the Dallas Morning News and, of course, a CBS News contributor-friendly face here on the show. Thanks so much for being with us, Javier. So how concerning is the credit downgrade for us Americans?
Look, in Moody's own words, and this is an exact quote, successive U.S. administrations, and in fact, we've now had 3 consecutive presidents who've had a credit downgrade as part of their fiscal policy. So Treasury Secretary Bessent was pretty dismissive in his reaction, partly because S&P, Fitch, and now Moody's have all coalesced around the obvious. U.S. debt and spending is unsustainable. It's been on that trajectory for quite some time. There's really no more road to kick the can down anymore, and the chickens are coming sort of home to roost. Look at what's happening. Primarily, we look at stock a lot, but it's really about bond markets. So the yields are telling us that this is something that we really need to be concerned about.
Okay, so the Federal Reserve pointed to 2 rate cuts this year. This morning, Atlanta Fed President Raphael Bostic told CNBC that he'd prefer just 1 cut. So how does changing news on tariffs really play into this rate cut decision?
Yeah, look, inflation isn't entirely whipped. In large part, that is because of the tariffs. And now it's pretty clear that, again, the bond market now has developed kind of a mind of its own. It really isn't cooperating with the Fed's policy prescriptions or President Trump. So it's a problem because the Fed is really inclined to cut. They really do kind of want to give the economy a little bit of a jolt. But the problem, of course, is that prices still remain high. That will continue to be the case so long as we're talking about international tariffs on all sorts of goods. And that is not likely to change anytime soon. We've got a bit of a reprieve with China. But, it really remains to be seen if we can work out a bunch of other side deals with a bunch of other countries. And the uncertainty is sort of really a bad news and an overhang for everyone.
Okay, we'll have to see how this one goes. Javier David, thank you.
Sure.
And still ahead this morning, we are watching powerful storm systems now marching across the country. The latest on your weather forecast coming up next. Stay with us. You're streaming CBS News 24/7. Welcome back. We've got some new reaction to a CBS News interview on the integration of AI and modern warfare. 60 Minutes sat down with Palmer Luckey, a tech billionaire behind a California defense products company that makes a line of autonomous weapons. Now, critics have called those types of weapons killer robots. Luckey said, though, it's simply the future of warfare. Listen.
It's a scary idea to some people.
It's a scary idea, but I mean, that's the world we live in. I'd say it's a lot scarier, for example, to imagine a weapon system that doesn't have any level of intelligence at all.
And earlier today, my colleague Michael George spoke with former acting U.S. Secretary of Defense Christopher Miller, who issued a stark warning on the dangers of autonomous warfare.
We've seen it in Ukraine. Drones have fundamentally changed the nature of war. Just think about it. A $3,000 drone can destroy $1.5 million tank, or just think about the Taiwan Straits, where fleets of drones can take out $14 billion. That's a B, $14 billion aircraft carriers. So this is exactly where warfare is going. But Michael, we have to remember that ultimately war will never change. The inherent nature is fear, hatred, violence, the unknown. And these tech evangelists and these tech bros that play video games, we have to be very careful about outsourcing our national security to them. We need to really, really talk about people that have been in the field or in the field now that know how to use these weapons and know the costs of getting it wrong.
Miller argued incorporating AI has led to likely the biggest development in warfare since the radio. He said more work needs to be done to figure out how to best utilize the tech properly. And we're watching that severe storm system as possible tornadoes and hail could now slam parts of the U.S. today. Let's bring in CBS News Philadelphia meteorologist Andrew Kozak with our last look at our national weather forecast. Hey, Andrew.
Hey, as we head into your start of the week, we're once again going to be talking about over 100 million people under the threat for severe weather. Let's walk over and show you what's happening for today, because the main event is going to happen this afternoon, especially across areas like Kansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, and Arkansas up I-44. Let's talk about our futurecast here. As we head into the later part of this afternoon, that's when we'll start to see those storms really start to blow up. By about 2, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we've got areas across Kansas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas starting to see those storms blow up. Look how quickly by about 5, 6 o'clock we start to see those storms become severe. We are talking about torrential rain, damaging winds, and yes, the possibility of not just isolated, but a couple of scattered tornadoes in this area. This kind of resets and recharges again for Tuesday. Unfortunately, those areas that were hit yesterday will once again see a chance for severe weather Tuesday. We're looking at areas like Tennessee, Kentucky. This eventually moves across the deep south as we head into your Wednesday and the mid-Atlantic as well. All right, rainfall by the time we get into the end of the week is also going to be pretty impressive. 4 to 8 inches, areas like St. Louis, flash flooding possible. And in these areas that we're watching today for the tornado threat, we could on top of that be looking at 6 to over 8 inches of rain. Today, we're going to be looking at temperatures in the 70s and 80s to the south. We'll even have a few 90s. Areas like Jacksonville looking at over 10 to 12 degrees above average. Once we get through the storms, though, a little cool down starts to hit the Midwest by the time we get into the middle of the week. Chanel?
All right, Andrew Kozak, thank you. And that does it for me for right now, but stay right where you're at after the break. Mugo Adigwe is live from San Francisco with breaking news from coast to coast.